Hello, everybody. It's great to be back with you again with this next episode of Herbcast. And today we're talking about herbs for mood and stress. Particularly, we're going to explore nervines and nootropics, maybe some sedatives. And I'm sure many of you know what nervines are, but they're a broad category of herbs that are used for helping emotions, and potentially controversial category within herbalism because it's such a broad category. And the nootropics, which are maybe a more modern, semi-trendy category for using herbs that help memory and cognition, executive function. So we're going to dive into that today. And we're very happy to be with Julian Barker, who's a herbalist of many years' repute, a great philosopher and clinical expert. And I think you've been in clinical practice since the early 80s, Julian. So welcome.
1979, I really started, yes.
1970. Okay, brilliant. Well, it's great to have you with us. And
thank you for having me.
You've written lots of books. I've enjoyed reading your books over the years, and so it's really, really great to meet today. And I thought we should just dive in, Julian. What do you think of herbal categories generally, and specifically nervines? What do you think about the term nervine?
Well, the term nervine seems a reasonable sort of a shorthand. It's curious, though, because we don't treat neurons. So to call it a nerve as if we treat a nerve, it's a bit strange. But I suppose we have to assume that what's meant is that nerves in the sense of you're getting on my nerves or I'm feeling nervous. Nervous indigestion might be closer to the mark in the sense that plant medicines are somatopsychic, and that by settling the stomach, say, we settle the attendant emotional disquiet. What you might use for nervous indigestion, however, you perhaps would not choose for generalized anxiety, for which you might make up a more complex mixture. Did you mention nootropics?
That's it.
Well, I mean, tropic seems reasonable again, because we recognize that plants seem to display the sorts of tropisms towards tissues in the body. And they seem rather general. And I think that's because they primarily tone or refresh mucosal surfaces in some way. And that refreshment shows up differentially in the mucosae of different organs, the digestion, the cardiovascular, ear, nose and throat, and so on. So surprise, surprise, this herb is said to be good for sore throats and for bowel problems, So I think that's the reason that they primarily treat mucosae. That's if it depends how you use them, it depends your scale of you using them. Perhaps we might talk about notions of scale in a moment. But when it comes to nootropic, it's difficult to see what this means. Is the brain is unlike other organs and tissues. What one calls nous, from the Greek, is a virtual structure. And a virtual structure, of course, is amenable to all sorts of perturbations and suggestions, and it can respond to words. Like, don't do that, or, please will you do this, or, so it's a bit difficult to understand that connection, being how that connection is made. But I mean, caffeine has CNS effects. There's no question about that. I think everyone seems, although actually people have lots of paradoxical effects with coffee, for instance. It depends what time of day you take it and what age you are. I mean, in my 20s, we lived above, I think 14 different coffee bars and restaurants. And before midnight, we would go down and have a cappuccino to say good, it's good night. I couldn't do that now. I mean, that's, so, and people do have paradoxical effects, and it depends upon what the rest of their life is doing. So to call caffeine a nootropic, I suppose, seems a bit pretentious, but to call tea nootropic, Camellia sinensis has a number of contrasting effects. Perhaps nicotine has a better claim on the term nootropic, because the nicotinic receptors are so deep in the parasympathetic nervous system. as you know, more than half of the receptors are nicotinic. So I would not call the plants that herbalists use in phytotherapy, I wouldn't call them nootropic unless they're drug plants.
I mean, what about things like, I don't know, rosemary or bacopa or things like this that are touted as being nootropic, these herbs that are used for enhancing cognition?
Well, they certainly enhance, they have an influence on the autonomic nervous system. So by definition, they will affect a kind of flow. And it seems that rosemary has, particularly to the brain, that may be because in some way rosmarinic acid can cross the blood-brain barrier. Who knows? Mm-hmm. I mean, probably someone does know. I'm not sure I can be bothered to find out, But really, one's using rosemary in a somatopsychic way, so that you're using it for a vascular effect, and that vascular effect will show itself in cerebral perfusion. Therefore, which is why Ophelia, Hamlet says to Ophelia, "Here's rosemary. That's for remembrance," punning on the word memory. So I've got a suspicion that people like these terms for scientific reasons. That is, scientism. It makes it sound respectable. Well, I don't think Shakespeare needed that. I think he accepted that the context, the person and the plant, were more important than any labels.
That's true, but I suppose we have them in a way to group plants together to help our understanding of this, huge sort of botanical pharmacy in a way, just to categorize. I mean, going back to Nervines a bit, it seems just too broad to me, because you can get relaxing Nervines and stimulating Nervines and antispasmodic. I know there's all sorts of herbs that fit into that category. That I think David Hoffman's book goes into sort of some breakdown of the categories of Nervines really well. I mean, tell me a bit more about how you might use herbs to, and how you might see someone that comes to you with, an issue around their mood. Broad question that is. How would you engage them with that?
Can I talk first of all more abstractly about mood?
Yes.
Before how one might treat the patient. I suppose. Where do I begin? First of all, the terrain is established between the 6th and the 13th week of our mother's pregnancy with us. So there's a huge imprint of neuroendocrine position, and that isn't going to change fundamentally. And if it leads to disorders of mood, feelings of unhappiness or distress or disquiet, it seems to me important that you actually look at the individual terrain, not generalize. This is good for anxiety. I don't think, personalized medicine, I think herbalists are a bit slow to come to her personalized medicine, because in orthodox medicine, people realize that actually we are unique. And I want to stress that I don't think personalized medicine's got anything to do with individualism. I think the individual forms him or herself by relations with others. And it's the relations that are important. So you're not fixed with the terrain. But you have to understand that that's the starting point. And so the first thing is to find out the whole constellation of relationships that the person has had from the time of the maternal grandmother, because of course she made the egg that made the person, and all the siblings and all the relationships and so on. And I think that when someone is witnessing themselves being witnessed in this whole way, it actually, they can relax, because they don't feel like an object of inquiry. They feel like a personage in a drama. And it's it may be a subtle distinction, but it's the most important distinction. So that if their feeling of mood is in disquiet, one has to say, well, is it agitated? Or is it simply generalized anxiety? Or is it depression? Or, which is very common, a cycling between them. So we all actually have a state cycle, and most state cycles are improved if they can entrain the state cycle of the sun and the moon. In other words, the day and the month and the season and the year. So you've got to also base their constellation in their birth months, and there is a slight effect of birth months on health. It's not huge, but January is, particularly. My mother was born in January, but and she bucks the trend. In all cases, what one is, how the person operates in the world, how we all operate in the world, is by energy. So you have to have some sort of energetic sense of how the person is operating. Now, I don't know if you know my poise theory. It goes, I'll be very brief. It says available energy, you have to have available energy, otherwise you're dead. So we've got available energy, that's a given, because without energy, there's no life. For 10 units, whatever those units might be, of available energy, you require for health, I say for health, to feel well, to feel perfectly well, 16 units of reserve. And if that drops to 15, you feel a bit weird in one way or another, depending upon your terrain. You feel anxious or fretful or giddy or dizzy or must lie down or some sort of... And it's that relationship that one actually steers through life with. At the end of a working day, of course, you're tired. And if you rest and then sleep, you'll recover your reserve energy. It's as simple as that. But if you override it in some way, or if your terrain, or if your psyche in some way impedes that because of earlier experiences and so on, that's not going to be possible. And so you're going to eat into your reserve and you're going to feel unwell. And pain and fatigue are the obvious first signs of loss of poise. Poise is what I call the ratio 10 to 16. But also anxiety, because anxiety is dissipated energy. Agitated states are, we are oscillators, and all our internal organs are in oscillation, and the signals are in constant oscillation. Agitated states are when the oscillation it's sort of too much noise and not enough signal. So these three, I say these three as if there are no others, but these three states of anxiety, depression, and agitated states, which of course is confluent with anxiety, require an energetic approach, is that actually you allow the person to recover their reserve energy. And you do that by attending to their terrain. If you're looking at the relatively delayed signals, you've got the autonomic nervous system. I mean, that's the easy bit in a way, because there's barely a plant that doesn't have an autonomic effect. I mean, I suppose marshmallow might be one. There are one or two others, but, they're unusual. The organ management of metabolism, liver, pancreas, kidney, it's not that you actually treat them particularly, but you facilitate their activity. More difficult when it comes to the kidney, because actually the thing is, with the kidneys, you want to leave it alone, let it do its work. And then the hypothalamic pituitary axes, the 4 axes, 2 are catabolic, 2 are anabolic. You've got to try and understand whether the person is fundamentally anabolic or fundamentally catabolic. And that isn't quite, you can't just say, someone who's overweight is anabolic and someone who's underweight is catabolic. It's not necessarily as simple as that. And then you have to look at their constitutional and acquired biases in the posterior pituitary. I'm thinking of oxytocin and ADH. They're particularly important for emotional response. And then the interplay again for for fundamental responses to the world is the interplay between prolactin and dopamine. The stimulus to create, to engage, to imagine, and the inhibiting effect of calm down, organize, let's have things, in proper order. I mean, if you wanted a caricature, high dopamine will be a gambler and high prolactin might be a librarian with respect to librarians. So these are the main nodes on which you try to understand. May I just interpolate that when you're in a consultation, you're using your right hemisphere, you're trying to be as wide and open and empathic to understand the reality of this person. Empathy is not sympathy. You're not trying to sympathize with their problems. You're trying to understand them. And for them to understand that you understand or that you're trying to understand, that itself is therapeutic. It's the basis of therapeutics.
Mm-hmm.
Theraps is Greek for handmaid, someone who is there attending to you, to your needs. So that's the primary thing. But occasionally you need to flip-flop. You need to go from this right hemisphere to the left. Analysis. Hold on. What does this mean? And try and come to a diagnosis. And then flip back again. And using that open, closed approach without appearing to do so, I think is the art of the therapist. Now, have I wandered off your question? I'm not sure.
No, not at all. You're painting a beautiful picture about how we must acknowledge and recognize people placed in their time and space, really, their whole
Yes.
journey, a very sort of relational approach to life. And you have, in order to help someone, as we're talking about anxiety, depression, agitation
Yes.
here, you have to understand the context in which they've arrived at that state in order to help them move through it. And, I like the way you place things in a sort of somatopsychic realm, that you talk about the herbs working in that way. It feels very grounded to me, Julian, and not too sort of, although some of the language you're using and some of it's quite technical and detailed in a way, that idea of grounding in the person and that ability to just hear someone, to really be present in that empathetic, compassionate, kind space, to hear someone's reality or their perceived reality, and to find a way to help them through, basically.
It's also worth saying, I think, that when I've treated for people who've had anxiety all their life, if you look at the prescriptions, there won't be valerian there. It's too obvious. I mean, if valerian was going to sort out their anxiety, they'd have sorted it out years ago.
Bought it off the shelf somewhere, probably, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't like that. You've got to try and understand where they're wasting energy, where you can allow their reservoir to fill. And once you see, activity is actually needs to be controlled. An agitated state is an uncontrolled state. Anxiety is an uncontrolled state. Depression is a hyper-controlled state. In other words, the energy is sequestered. It doesn't flow at all. And the anxiety, it flows in a very surface way. So in other words, you've got to find out where the flow needs to be unstopped. And of course, when it comes to depression, let me just say that if your available energy, if your reserve energy is in some way compromised, one thing that you can appear to save energy on is going to spasm. And spasm closes down. But spasm is actually very expensive in energy. So all the sphincters of the body will be closed down, including the sphincters in the biliary tree. And therefore bile won't be released, and therefore you've got melancholia, the chole, the bile, cannot be released. So the microbiome is not fed. It's not lubricated. It's not altered to deal with lipid metabolism in the way the bacteria can't do so well as we can. And so bile, the ancients were right about that. I think choleric and melancholic.
Do you see that as quantitative in a sense, or do you see it as stagnation? Because you're talking about energy in terms of almost an account that you've got, a sort of certain amount. And when you're talking about this melancholia and this sort of contraction of sphincters and blockage in the flow of life essences, do you also relate this to some type of, I don't know, I'd call it a blockage or stagnation, or that's how I would see depression, and that's how I might approach it and treat
it. It's sphincter blockage. I mean, it will lead to stagnation, of course, but it's simply blockage. I mean, you need dino rod. It's kind of territory, but you don't actually need the dino rod. I'm sorry, it's a silly. What you need to relax, but to relax, you need energy, because relaxation is actually an energy requiring function.
Well, so I sort of see it as quite qualitative versus quantitative in a way, that that you need the energy, which is like a quantitative amount of something. But then relaxation feels like a quality in a way that one can, it's like a perspective you can put on life. You can, you can see, you can go out in nature and you can be in a foul mood and you can just not see the beauty, for example, of, I don't know, a rising sun. Rare that might be, to not be happy at a rising sun. Or you can have other times when you can be totally ecstatic at seeing, I don't know, bumblebee landing on the flower. And so that feels more of an engaged space. So I'm just interested in how might you build someone's energy in that case? If there is a deficiency you're seeing and people need energy to relax. How might
you have to spot where the leaks are, or where the dams are. The leaks and the dams is really what you're trying to facilitate. And of course, they lead to qualities. I mean, quantities are only the substrate on which qualities emerge. I mean, there will be a quality. You don't have to feature the quantities particularly. When I talk about 10 to 16, it's a ratio. It's not really a quantity.
Okay.
Yeah, you have to find out where the dams are. For instance, oxytocin, which is, it creates spasm. Now, oxytocin is famously needed for orgasm, for ovulation, birth, for contraction, uterine contraction for birth, and for letting down the milk. So it's fundamental to life. But if it's operating all the time, if it's on all the time, it kind of is being that makes for a very intense life. I mean, those situations which I've just described are intense, but they don't go on all the time. Let's hope, So that's one, for instance. The autonomic nervous system, if someone is vagotonic, so congested that they cannot charge that congestion, then you've got to open the stoppers. And usually you do that with beta mimetics. I don't know, it might be pine kernels, it might be cinnamon, it might be sage. But of course, with every one of those plants, you think sage is estrogenic and this person has got breast cancer, so you wouldn't use sage. And, so there's a lot to keep in your head. But as you practice, the model becomes less abstract and more almost like an object in your head. I mean, I think that's how we think. So the model isn't sort of inscrutable and it isn't fixed, and it's plastic and can relax, but it needs to be fixed. Otherwise, you're wandering about all over the place, just using empirically. I mean, that's hit and miss. And that really there's no future in that. And it's not very rewarding because you don't know why people get better or don't get better. If you use things, whereas if you use a very good complex model, when it fails, you can find out how and you can change and do something better.
You mean there's a logic that you can follow? Yeah.
The thing about empiricism, you don't learn anything. You just do the same thing over and over again. 50% of the time it works, 50% it doesn't. What have you learned?
You mean you're just repeating what you found out from somewhere else or something else? You're not basing
No,
it
if
on
you
your
say, oh,
concept.
such and such is if you say valerian is a hypnotic, this person is anxious, so we'll give them a hypnotic. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. But you know it's a hypnotic anyway. You haven't learned anything. And the person has sometimes got better and sometimes hasn't. Often not. So that's why, to be a herbalist, you need to have develop your model and use it consistently and learn from it every day. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. I mean, that's what learning is.
Are you suggesting that people should develop their own model off the basis of what they've learned? Because it sounds like you developed a very clear model, and something I've often wondered about herbalism is that having studied quite a lot of Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, they've got quite a fixed, almost like if you practice Ayurvedic medicine, it's this way, or Chinese medicine this way. Not quite like that, but there is a sort of linear path. Whereas in Western herbal practice, I almost feel like you can meet you can meet different schools of practitioner, and they've got very different models in a way, probably because of the world we've grown up in within modern scientific understanding. So the model you've developed, Julian, is that an eclectic approach that you've gathered over the years, or were there some foundational learnings that you had along the way, some foundational teachings that have helped you build that?
It's interesting, isn't it? When I first came across the work of Dr. Durafour and Dr. Jean-Claude Lapraz in the 80s, I didn't know what they were talking about, but I somehow knew they were on to something. So I think there has to be a relationship between what you didn't know, the mind you had before the world was born, as to use Gates's phrase. Somehow there's a fellow feeling there. And I have no fellow feeling with antiquarian. I have some sympathy with Parkinson, for instance, and so on. When you see someone who was actually trying to understand the world. With Gerard, I think he was just on the make, really. And I think he was just, to say he borrowed things I think is being polite. And with Ayurveda, I don't know anything about Ayurveda. I mean, it seems to have a tripartite constitutional understanding. Well, that seems to me too hierarchical and too definitive. And I don't understand, and I've never been to India, and I don't. So it's culturally, it's not sympathetic to me. Whereas when I went to Mexico, I was very sympathetic to the notion of the null and the tonal in Castaneda's terms. And I'm not sure I've entirely lost that. The thing is, the model has to be implicit. You don't parade it particularly, although I do try and explain myself to patients. I'm rambling a bit here, sorry. Now, when I came across Durafour and Lapraz, it seemed to be coherent and flexible at the same time. If it's incoherent, it's no good. If it's inflexible, it's no good to me. It needs to be both, because biology is flexible. Because if we're not flexible, we don't survive very well. We certainly don't thrive. But if we're too flexible, we're in a mess. And it seems so. The model, I suppose, is based upon that. Enough flexibility to be adaptive and not too inflexible to be constrained. But
so what did they add? What did they add to your training? Because obviously you had a background in sort of classical Western herbalism, should we say? What did studying with Dr. Lapraz really bring to you?
Well, the notion of the terrain.
Right.
Which is not Claude Bernard came out with it in 1859.
Yeah.
Same year as Darwin's, so not a new idea.
And it is very related back to Ayurveda and just talking about the constitution there. It is that is how Ayurveda practices in a way. It's a study of the terrain of the individual. It's classified it around the doshas and things like that. But within that is much attention and detail is paid to the nuances of differences in digestion, temperature, stages of life, seasons, times of the year, times of life, etc. The whole relationship with treatment is based around daily habits, monthly habits, seasonal habits, around that are fixed to that person. But I'm fascinated in the way you've arrived at that and how you've articulated it around, science as well, in a way, that there is the very sort of human element that you've got in there in this exploration of the terrain, and you sort of contemporized it in a way. It seems like when I read your writing about how herbs work and relationship with central nervous system, ANS, PNS, etc.
Well, physiology is fascinating, and one thing I slightly upsets me about antiquarian systems is it's sort of pretending we don't know what we know. We live in the modern world, but many of us drive motor cars and look, we're using this technology, which depends upon quantum mechanics. It so happens. I don't understand quantum mechanics any more than perhaps you do, but that's not the point. To pretend we don't acknowledge these things seems a bit puerile, really.
Well, I think lots of these antiquarian systems and around the world are contemporizing in a way and modernizing through research, through requirements and necessity on safety, drug herb interactions, or the necessity of helping people heal and remove pain as quickly as possible. But you're right, I hear what you're saying, but within the sort of theoretical framework, that is sort of, there's a constancy there.
Well, the models were formulated in the ancient world according to the world they were in, and we're not in the same world. I mean, in some ways, there is a persistence. I mean, I suppose apart from Dufour and Lapraz, actually Hippocrates. Hippocrates was an ecologist. He was a health ecologist. And if you read some of the works he clearly was more than one author. Some of the works of Hippocrates, you realize that actually understood that the influences of the environment were potent, and also of the Constitution, that the Constitution was inherited. It's a pretty clear idea. Of course, it depends on circumstance. If you're in a war zone, you use a different sort of medicine. If you're in an accident and emergency. So it depends on, we're blessed that we're in a very fractious world, but at the moment we lead peaceful lives to a large extent.
Yes.
Well, speaking for myself.
I know. Well, given that, have you got any insights as to what you think is going on with what appears to be, high levels of anxiety, depression, sort of social distress that comes into your clinic when we do live in, a relative abundance in some ways? How come there is this growth in anxiety and depression that comes into our clinics, and you can see in prescription numbers and the amount of antidepressants, sedatives, etc. used? What do you think is going on there, Julian?
Well, if you look at when the printing press came in, it was a time of huge upheaval. And you think of Thomas Wyatt, the poet. He lived in the court of Henry VIII. You could, two syllables, and I'm quoting from someone else, 2 syllables could end your life. 2 of the wrong syllables. So it's a very paranoid world. And until by the 18th century, people had settled down, people publishing pamphlets, which was the sort of social media of the day. And well, until the 19th century, it all calmed down. Then we have the Industrial Revolution, got to react to that. And now we've got this social media age, which is bringing sort of a paranoid mindset. And it's also allowing individualism, which I think is pernicious. And that's why I say personalized medicine is not about individualism. It's almost the opposite. And so we've lost the world of everyone wants to celebrate themselves instead of celebrating the world and our relationships one another. And so, and trying to, I mean, people tell me, and they're not young people in their 40s tell me, when I say, when I go to dispense, I say, oh, read any of the books you like, and here's some magazines. They say, oh no, I've got my phone. I didn't know what they meant. But they're looking up stuff and communicating with people whom they've never met. And they tell me they're addicted to it. So it's a paranoid, it's a very inflexible, it's very fixed, it's very paranoid. Anyway, I don't have a remedy for that, except, I've never been on social media. And I live life according to, I have a very high sensory world, which is not, I don't live in a virtual world, even though we're being virtual here. But it doesn't feel virtual. I can see you've got books. So I've got books.
It's pretty connected. We can see. Can't quite touch, but we can see it here. So interesting. So are you saying that you think maybe there's more anxiety and paranoia grown up in the world, and so that's what's coming into our clinics?
Well, I see a lot of older people, so not altogether. But anxiety and depression is very often, it goes back to, the terrain, and so one has to look at the terrain of the individual. Also, I think the scale of plants that we use is what has, certainly in Britain, what we've lost, and maybe they're losing in France too, is that, we survive by plants, food plants, and the more food plants you have in your diet, the better healthier you are. And seasoning is involved, so culinary herbs and spices. And introducing those at a very early age is a very potent source of good health. And because, of course, the sensory priming, and the sensory priming of taste and texture and smell resides in the limbic system. So although the doses are very small, they're cumulative. And people have got rather denuded diets in a way, not only of food plants, but of I'd say, do you use parsley? No, not very often. So, I suppose I use 12 culinary herbs and spices in pretty well every meal I make. And got a new cookbook, I don't know if you know, Eat Well, Feel Well. And it's trying to encourage people to not only do this for themselves, but for their children. Because that's where you build up, I call it a sensory priming. So that when you do have medicinal plants, at very low doses, they're actually primed to receive them.
Right.
So I think of, I think of three sorts of characterizations. I hesitate to use the word category of plants, which is complex simples. A good example is chamomile. It's probably not cumulative, but it treats, at quite low doses, a very identifiable area of the stomach and so on. And by being somatopsychic, relaxes, the nervous indigestion, actually reduces the nerves as well as the digestion. The two are connected, of course. I call them complex simples. Plants that we mostly use are simple complexes. For instance, burdock. For instance, black horehound. Actually, white horehound as well. Where, of course, there are pharmacological effects, but the pharmacological effects are really quite transient and not huge, but they're modifying the terrain. And then thirdly, drug plants. So the opium poppy and so on, with very toxic effects and very cumulative effects. And I don't use drug plants myself. Used to, but I don't think you get the best results that way.
We're not allowed to use a poppy.
Well, we're not allowed to use poppy, but I can't think of any others. Apart from Ephedra, for instance. Ephedra,
right.
Ephedra anymore. I occasionally use
Convallaria
Convallaria myalis.
Convallaria, yeah.
because it has other effects, apart from its cardiovascular effects, especially on thyroid function.
Well, I think smelling a lily of the valley is the cure for
Yeah,
all the ails in the world. All
yeah,
you have to do is smell it or look at it and you feel better. So, yeah,
yes,
taking it internally, you need to be very careful indeed.
yes,
Um,
yes.
See a herbalist to ensure that.
And we talked about paranoia. It actually, if you perceive beauty, it's very difficult to. The paranoid state can't really see beauty.
Mm.
So if you can relax someone enough for them to see the beauty of the world, they can start to get better. I suppose what I would say is that pharmaceutical agents or drug plants have got a very high power and a very narrow focus, whereas the herbs we use have very low power and very wide focus. When talking to patients, I often say, look, the electricity in the wall there, you could boil a kettle with it. Whereas my watch has got a tiny battery, but it's not placebo electricity. It makes my watch go. It's real.
It's real.
And it doesn't boil a kettle of water. This is not what it's good for.
No. Yeah,
Or
I like
intended.
that. So is that, do you use Melissa? I assume you use lemon balm and
Yes, I do.
lavender and some of these. Do you call that complex? Simple complex?
Yes. Complex, yes. Complex. They're simple complexes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And
More
chamomile.
basic introduction.
I mean, it's a bit arbitrary, of course. I'm making, that's just a rule of thumb for how I think about them. And of course, it depends on dose, because I use chamomile very often at higher doses, and then it becomes a simple complex, not a complex simple.
What's a high dose for you? Do you think of some of these ones?
I mean, using a tincture rather than a tisane, and
Right.
using, I don't know, 30-40% of a mixture. That's quite a strong, and it becomes cumulative then, I think. And well, the person taking it every day anyway.
One thing I've noticed from reading some of your books and writings, Julian, is that you seem to use am I right, lots of flowers and leaves, but there aren't
Yes.
so many roots and barks I've noticed in your
Which environmentally,
description.
it's environmentally much more sustainable, because you've got to dig the plant up, and you've got to strip it, you've got to destroy it.
Yeah,
So
barks are particularly harsh, aren't they, in a way? You can sort of,
yeah,
like with a root, you can replant the crown and things like that. But
yeah,
barks, well, there's lots of plants, coppice, of course, well, but it's still, yeah, it's a bit more invasive, isn't
yes.
it?
So I use herba, not cortex, so much, really, I would say.
Mm, lovely. And well, you've given us some nice, well, not nice, some powerful insights, I think, in how you approach treatment and personalizing it. And I'm aware that we're not going to talk about herbs for anxiety or depression per se, because I hear that approach. But maybe you could share just some of the other species that you find useful for working with a destabilized terrain where the mood and the psyches become upset, as it can through many of life's challenges. I mean, it's natural to be a bit anxious
Yes,
or depressed
yes.
at some point. It's not a pathology necessarily unless it carries on for too long. So just interested, you've got such an interesting approach. What would be your other
Well,
favorite?
uh, well, I don't believe in favoritism. That's the start. Is it good parents
Well,
don't
one of your loyal supporters.
in nature, but I have a certain fidelity, if you like, towards the alleviates. You think of all the alpha sympathetic
Mhm,
reducing plants like lavender, is so obvious.
mhm,
Melilot,
mhm.
which melilot, you need to understand the person using melilot. So it is someone with a lot of melilot is very good for introspective people, whereas lavender is rather good across the board. It's very interesting, people who dislike, and there are people who dislike the smell of lavender. So you don't lose that, but it tells you something about their terrain. Angelica is very useful, and here I use the root, because the trouble is with the fruits and the leaves of the umbelliferae is that they're very estrogenic, and you don't always want that. whereas the root is much lesser.
Mm.
So if you're trying to avoid, there are all sorts of situations where you're trying to avoid estrogenizing plants, you would avoid the umbelliferae altogether. But the angelica would be an exception.
And it's a biennial, so you wouldn't really be, you can almost count it as a sort of aerial plant. It's a biennial, so it will disappear off after a while. It's
yes,
rooted
indeed.
weight.
Good
So you're
point.
not-
Very
not
good
harmed.
botanical point. Yes. Excellent. Leonurus cardiaca is just very remarkable in its flexibility. Pallotta nigra, black hornhound, and especially Lamium album, because in the literature it's supposed to be good for cystitis and urinary tract infections and for vaginitis, but it's also a very profound blocker of central beta blocker. Can I tell you an anecdote about?
Please do.
I was going to my brother's funeral last year, and I thought I would go the country way. I got stuck in mud up a farm track on the way to Winchester, where it's going. I shouldn't take the motorways. You don't have these problems on motorways. And I had to call the AA in the end. I couldn't get out because a tree was in the way, of course, which no harm for the tree. Anyway, they were taking hours. It was a wonderful day. It was a very calm, autumn, sunny day. And behind the car was a long stretch of Lamium album. And I ate my way through it. When the AA bloke arrived 3 hours later, he said, "You seem very calm, sir." I said, "Well, I'm just eating this lot." And from his eyes, I could see the notion takes all sorts.
Can't have been the average collection that have come across there. But it's a very good example of how you're able to meet the moment yourself with some support from nature and a bit of wisdom.
Yes.
I really enjoyed speaking, Julian. Thank you so much for all that you do and the wisdom and care and love you bring to our community. Is there anything I haven't asked you? I mean, probably quite a lot in a way, but is there anything you want to share at the end with any of our listeners?
I think that the usefulness of, and I'm not trying to sell an idea here. I suppose there are only two things we can ever do. Any therapeutic intervention needs to increase a person's adaptive capacity or reduce a person's adaptive burden, or both. That's what you're doing in the end, one way or another.
Mm.
And I do think it's important to attend to the notion of energy and circadian burns. Circa lunar, circa tidal, circa seasonal, circa annual, and also seeing their stage in life and so on. You need to sort of anticipate all these things before you start reaching for any herbs.
Mm.
So first the therapy, then the nurture, how you can alter their lives, and only then the herb.
Well, you've summed all that up beautifully in your book. I think your most recent book you've written is called Physic, which we'll put a link in. And it's a deep dive into your world model you've created. So I'd recommend it to any herbalist or healer that wants to understand health more deeply.
Thank you.
Great, Julian. Lovely to speak. Take care.
Good to speak to you too. Bye-bye for now. Bye.